Hello, my name is Aaron Boley, and I am a Canada Research Chair in Planetary Astronomy, and I'm also one of the co-directors of the Outer Space Institute. And today, we are happy to have Dr. Margarita Marinova to join us today to talk about space exploration and Mars. And as we go through this discussion, you will find that Dr. Marinova is quite an impressive person. And let me just start by reading you her bio. Dr. Margarita Marinova has been contributing to space and planetary exploration in both science and engineering capacities for 15 years. Her overarching goal is to advance human exploration through science and technology, leveraging the confluence of the two to further humanity's reach into our solar system, improve rocket capabilities and reusability, gain deeper understanding of Earth and its planetary neighbors, and applying these advancements to improve life on Earth. Dr. Marinova received her bachelor's in aerospace engineering from MIT and continued to obtain a master's and PhD in planetary sciences from Caltech. She has worked at Airbus Space Propulsion and Engine Nozzle Research and Development at NASA Ames Research Center as a planetary scientist. Most recently, she was at SpaceX as a propulsion systems responsible engineer for the vertical takeoff and landing of FNR-DEV vehicle responsible engineer for internal research and the reusability program, and senior Mars development engineer working on mission architecture and vehicle design for the Starship vehicle and its planetary missions. Dr. Marinova, thank you so much for joining us. To start, I would like to ask you, because you have worked on such a wide range of projects in areas of both aerospace and planetary science, what are your principal interests and motivations for these studies?
Well, thanks, Aaron. First, I want to say I'm so happy to be talking to you, and the work that the Outer Space Institute is doing is really exciting. So what are my motivations? You read my bio, and there's definitely some variety in there. And I thought about it a bunch, and I think really a lot of the motivation is that I'm an explorer at heart. The way I think of it is that I never grew out of being a 4-year-old and asking why does this work this way? You know, taking things apart and trying to figure out how they work. So really the motivation and the thing that puts them all together is exploration. And I really fell in love with space exploration and Mars exploration when I was pretty young, and that has really persisted. And planetary science and engineering and also exploring extreme environments on Earth, to me, that's really all parts of the same puzzle. It's all parts of the how do we explore these extreme environments? How do we live in these extreme environments? And then how do we actually create the engineering to allow us to further where we explore and further where we can live. So that's really the thread that runs through everything I've done. And I think it's really representative actually of what space exploration means. Space exploration and planetary exploration is not just for one type of people. And especially when we think about living in those places, it's really the combination of all the expertise and all the types of people that we have on Earth that you need to put together in order to be able to live in these places. And so I think it all makes a lot of sense in terms of putting all those things together. And that's how we further space exploration and planetary exploration.
So you've worked as engineering and planetary sciences, and you've done so much with Mars. I would like to ask you a question related specifically to Mars, particularly since as people are listening to this conversation, I really hope that they can build a bit of a mental picture on both the complexities of Mars as a planet and some of the motivations to go there. And so, when you view Mars, you see all these range of features, and there are several prominent ones. One of those is known as the Martian dichotomy, and it is a topic on which you've had quite the impact. And so I'm hoping you might be able to tell us a little bit about that particular area.
Absolutely. So Mars is an interesting planet in many respects. One of them is the multitude of large features that it has. It has the largest volcanoes in the solar system, the largest canyon in the solar system, and then, as you mentioned, a very striking characteristic is the Martian dichotomy. So even just when you look with the naked eye at Mars, you can see that the northern part is darker, it looks a little smoother, while the southern part is more cratered and a little lighter. So that's referred to as the Martian dichotomy. There's certainly the visual aspect where you see that difference, but really the more striking part is that the crustal thickness in the north and in the south is very different. On average, they're about 30 kilometers different in crustal thickness, which is significant. And so there's been a long-standing question of how this actually formed, what could have caused it. There are two theories of how this happened. One of them was internal mantle convection, and that if you have degree 1 mantle convection, so you literally just have one large cell that circles around the planet, that can thin one side, thicken the other side, and that's how you get it. The other theory was that a large impact could come in and effectively the northern lowlands, as they're called, could be a large impact crater. So that's what I looked at for my PhD is, could you actually create the northern lowlands with a large impact? For a long time, the concern was that an impact of that size would actually melt the entire planet. You can imagine that to take off that much crust over such a large area, the energies involved are very high. And so you could, if you melt the entire surface, you effectively reset the planet and you wouldn't have a signature of this impact that remains. What I thought was really cool about the work that we did and the way that we did the actual simulations is that we started with the question of, let's understand large impacts overall. We actually see large impacts throughout the solar system. The moon has South Pole Aitken Basin, Mercury has a large impact. Basically every large body that you see has a large impact. So we started with that and did a whole slew of different impact energies, different impact velocities, different impact angles, compositions, all of that. And in the end, the impactor that produced the most dichotomy-like structure on Mars, as far as we could tell, was actually what is predicted to be the last large object in Mars crossing orbit. And so the two things sort of really fit together at the end, which is certainly always exciting when you're doing research, right, when things fit together like that. But yeah, so what we found is that actually with the asteroid, when it comes in, it actually leaves a lot of the energy into the mantle. So some of the material, like a normal impact, just goes into space, some of it escapes, but a lot of the energy goes deeper into the mantle. And so it doesn't melt the surface, it doesn't cover the entire surface with melted material. A lot of the energy goes inside. You remove material in a way very similar to what we see with the northern lowlands, and actually everything fit together very well. So I would say there's that was pretty strong evidence that that's how it formed. It's really exciting to, contribute to the formation of such a large and important structure on a planet. So it was a really great project for me to work on.
Oh, that's excellent. And there's the Hellas Basin also on Mars, not nearly as large of an impact as what you would have to have for the Martian dichotomy. You also have Planitia, Utopia. So you have all these regions that, planets have been hit by things since, well, as part of their formation. It's just part of the process.
Absolutely.
And so, having giant impacts and looking for looking for the signatures of giant impacts late in the lifetime of these planets is a really interesting area of research. Now, Mars is in many ways different from Earth, but in many ways similar to Earth. And so there's this area or a fundamental tool in planetary science called comparative planetology. And it's something that we end up teaching in Astronomy 101 when we're doing the solar system and so forth. But I was wondering if you'd be able to kind of go through that exercise a little bit for us of comparing Mars and Earth in the context of what are some of the differences, what are the similarities, And why do we think we can go there?
So for me, at least, certainly that the combination of both Mars is in a lot of ways similar to Earth, or was similar to Earth, and its differences now and also in the past are one of the most fascinating things. In the past, we think that Mars was quite a bit wetter. There's still questions for how long it was much wetter, but there's quite a bit of evidence that there was a lot of liquid water on the surface, maybe ice-covered lakes versus without just normal water in contact with the atmosphere. But there's a lot of evidence that there were these similarities. It was warmer, it was wetter, and it had an atmosphere to be able to sustain that liquid surface, that liquid on the surface, so it didn't just sublimate away. Today, Mars is significantly drier. It's very cold, not cold by Canadian standards, actually. That's something I like to remind people, that in summer at the equator on Mars, you actually get to about plus 15 C, which pretty warm. So those aspects of the similarities and differences, I think, is really fascinating. How do we know that that was the case? I mean, all of that, or the majority of it, was really from comparative planetology. The reason why we are pretty sure that Mars was wet in the past is because when we look at the surface of Mars, we can see these river valleys. And then we compare how the morphology of the river valleys to those that we see on Earth, and from that try to infer. So for example, actually, for a little bit, I was involved in some research looking at the fractal nature of river networks. And on Earth, there's a very specific fractal signature to river networks, and it's different depending on what the source of the water is. So if you have subsurface water that's coming up versus when you have rain. And you can do the same analysis on Mars and see that it matches rainwater significantly better for most parts, right? You can see variation throughout the surface, but there are areas and river networks where it matches a rain fractal network much better. So that's an example where certainly the comparative planetology was really used to figure out what was happening on Mars. Very similar for a lot of the other features that we see. And it's an important way. You have to start from somewhere in order to be able to interpret the other features. The robotic missions that we've sent to Mars have certainly also been very helpful in figuring that out. Getting chemical composition on the surface adds a very important part of the story of how these features actually formed. For example, what type of volcanoes that we have, whether it's an explosive one or not, can tell you a lot about the mantle composition and the actual internal processes of the planet, and then further tells you what the actual surface composition is. So it's really a hand in hand. We look at Mars, we see what it looks like on Earth. You have to make some inferences about, how does the different composition of the planet, the different composition of the atmosphere, gravity, all of those, how do they affect it? Get some orbital or on-surface data and iterate on those to figure out what's actually happening on Mars. An aspect that I think is really exciting right now as well in terms of what we do is go to extreme environments on Earth and study those in more detail to get a closer picture of what's happening on Mars. So I've been involved in work going to a lot of deserts on Earth, both hot and cold ones. So Arctic, Antarctic, Atacama Desert, Namib Desert. And even though the hot deserts are hot, so not quite like Mars, they're very dry. And dry processes, surface processes, is something that really I think needs more work. It's just so different from our usual experience on Earth of how just how features are formed, how geochemistry works when you have a lot of liquid water available is very different from when you have very little water available. And for example, wind can be one of the dominant processes for moving things around. So there's a lot of analog research on Earth happening right now where we go to extreme environments on Earth. We study them in a lot of detail because instead of just creating a model and semi-hoping it's right? There are a lot of assumptions that have to be made in a model just from necessity because you don't have all the information. When you go to these extreme environments on Earth, you can make the model, but you can collect data at the same time and verify that your model is actually accurate, and tune it to make sure that you're not actually missing some important aspect that you assumed was a minor contribution, but is actually a significant contribution. So you verify your models that way, and then it's a smaller step to apply those models to Mars and figure out what's happening on that smaller scale. So I think all of those aspects then, when you think of people going to Mars, is really important. So certainly from the orbital aspects, we have information of where you can find subsurface ice. Subsurface ice is critical to a human mission, not just necessarily because you need to drink water, but because in order to create the propellant to come back home, you really need to be utilizing your in situ resources, and especially the water. It becomes an extremely difficult problem if you're trying to bring with you all the propellant. You bring it to Mars so that then you can take that propellant and come back home with it. So orbital information that helped us determine where the subsurface ice is tells you where you want to land. You need more information on, well, how am I actually going to access that ice? And that's where actually a lot of analog research comes in, and the experience of, well, this is what, for example, debris-covered glaciers look like on Earth. These are the sizes of rocks, the morphology, if you're using a drill, this is sort of the features it's going to encounter. We need to take those into account. And so then you can use the combination of these types of data to figure out, how are we going to go on Mars? Where are we going to land? How are we going to live there? And do that full range of details from, the very big picture, where you're going to land, to how am I actually going to drill into the subsurface? So bringing it all together. And I think that's something that's really exciting, is really taking all these aspects and bringing them together.
Well, you anticipated my next question, which was asking about the Earth and Mars analogs. So you went right into that. So there are kind of two questions that I want to ask and follow up to that. One of them, though, goes back a little bit, because there's so much evidence for water on Mars, past water flowing on Mars, and there's the paraglacial activity telling us that something is happening now. There are kind of two pictures that are kind of currently being thrown around, and one of them is the warm, wet Mars, and the other one is this cold, heavily glaciated Mars. And going back to kind of your work on impacts, if you have impacts, that could create this flooding, which may be able to give you some of the features that we see. And I was wondering if you could comment on these two different pictures, if it really matters for the decisions that are being made for going to Mars at this time, or if that's just a question of evolution of planets.
Very interesting question. I think it's more, for people going to Mars, I think the real question you ask is, are there the resources there in order to sustain a human presence? It's too far away for us to continuously send things to Mars, especially if you're going towards, you have to create your own propellant, especially if you have larger groups of people living there. It doesn't really work out to send the propellant to bring them back. So you have to create it. Mm-hmm. So in terms of sending people to Mars, I'm much more on the side of, let's see if there are the resources that we require to really support people living on Mars. And I think the answer to that is yes. We have so much evidence of subsurface ice on Mars, and it's enough. So I think sometimes when we envision how much material we need, certainly for a society on Earth where you have a 10 million person city or something like that, that's a lot of resources that are needed. But when you think about smaller groups of people, I think we have sufficient evidence to show that we do have those resources on Mars to actually support that size of group of people. And then also knowing that whether it was exactly all liquid water or whether it was more glaciated, ice-covered lakes, that sort of aspect, it still tells you that there was water there. Yeah. And we're pretty sure that water, there are arguments about how much of it may have escaped to space, but there's still, we don't think all of it escaped to space. So doing that, looking at where Mars was, and then also together with the current data that shows that there's subsurface ice, I think that answers the question of whether we can support people there. And the rest is more the details. It's actually an interesting aspect that there is a lot of cool science to be done on Mars, clearly, but there's a distinction between when you look at Mars as a place for people to live, and does it have the resources, and do we know what we need to know to operate a backhoe to get to the ice, versus what is the exact climatic condition on Mars, and what did the last 10 million years look like. And I think that's an important thing to actually keep in mind in these discussions. It doesn't mean that one is more important than the other. They're just slightly different perspectives on looking at the question.
So going back to or now going forward with building that mental picture of Mars, and with looking for resources, where do we go on Mars? Where are some of the ideal places for us to actually put spacecraft down and start building those habitations?
So the first part is having the ice. We need that. So that limits to some degree where on the planet you can land, or you would want to land. Then another aspect is that you need, at least initially, I think that we'll be using solar power on Mars. So you want to be further south in order to have a more consistent solar installation to support all functions in the habitat. So both for people and for propellant production. And then also more equatorward to be warmer. Thermal issues can be very significant. So on Mars, because of the thinner atmosphere, even the daily variations in temperature are on the order of 60 degrees, if I remember correctly. So 60 degrees Celsius. And so even on a daily basis, the variation is huge. And then if you add the seasonal cycle with being further north, it can get quite extreme, and the engineering challenges just get very significant. So being closer to the equator for power and thermal reasons mainly, and then I would say actually landing on top of an area that has subsurface ice would be the things to go for. There are secondary items that I go back and forth a little bit on how much we need to consider those now, but looking further into the future with the idea that we want to have a self-sustaining outpost on Mars, something that can grow, something that doesn't really constantly rely on large shipments of materials from Earth. You may look at, are there metals in the area? Does it look like you can mine it? Or even, is the material more solid versus more like loose regolith and gravel that is easier to acquire and then process? I think those are a little bit more secondary questions, but certainly something that should also have some more thought put into it.
Have you considered remnant magnetization as any of the kind of drivers for where to put people, just for, if it has any extra protection as a result of that? And we should probably define what's meant by remnant magnetization.
Absolutely. So on Earth, because we have a nice magnetic field that protects us from a lot of the radiation from space, so especially from solar wind, that provides a very significant protection. On Mars, we think there was magnetization in the past, and that's because we see areas where the crust is still magnetized, and that provides some local protection to those areas. Certainly a nice thing to have. A lot of those places are in the southern hemisphere. The southern hemisphere, an aspect I forgot before, you also need to be at a lower elevation so that landing is easier. You basically have more atmosphere to go through to help slow you down as you're coming in. So the southern hemisphere, the elevation is higher, so it's harder to land on it. There aren't really places with ice. So even that's where the strongest local magnetic fields are. That would be really challenging it doesn't really have the ice, so that sort of takes away your constrained. In the northern hemisphere, at least what I've looked at has focused more on where do you find the ice and where are you sure you're going to find the ice, and what is that local distribution of ice more than the magnetic aspects. There are multiple ways to protect against radiation. So I think I would err more on getting to the ice and using it is critical to survival. Like there's just no way to get around it. And so I would put a lot more weight on that, just because there are other mitigation techniques for radiation. So I would put a lot more weight on making sure that we know that that is going to work.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. If you're okay, I'd like to move more towards some of the exploration considerations and specifically the spacecraft that we're going to use to get there. And so you've done quite a bit of work on things such as Starship, and Starship was designed specifically for taking people to Mars and setting up a self-sustaining presence. So how did those needs translate into the current Starship design?
When we think of sending people to Mars, a really important question is, why are you sending them there? If the goal is to go for a couple of years, do a bunch of research, bring them back, you can brute force the question. You can probably, if you're really required to, you can bring the propellant with you. There are more complicated architectures where you can do that. You need less infrastructure that you have to put on the surface of the planet to actually support those people. When you're thinking of, though, having a more sustained exploration program, or of actually having a real outpost there that is growing, so think of Antarctic, the U.S. Antarctic program, or many of the other countries, right? Their Antarctic programs, where McMurdo during summer has about 1,200 people there. If you're thinking on that scale, you're really driven to having a real base, right? I think Antarctica is a really good analog to think about these things, but McMurdo is a real base. I think of it as a high-tech village. It has like super high-tech science labs and machine shops and everything else, and then dorms for everybody to sleep in. So it's like a high-tech little village. But when you think on that scale and the infrastructure required for to actually support that, and especially if you're trying to grow and become self-sustaining, the amount of stuff you have to bring with you is pretty significant. Mm-hmm. I think of it as when you move your house, you usually can't just stuff everything in the car. I mean, maybe when you're an undergrad you can, but once you get past that stage, you get the moving van. And you need that moving van in order to put everything you need to survive at your next spot. And if you think about it, at your next spot, you even have the house, you have the plumbing, you have everything else, and you still need that moving van in order to move your stuff. So that was really the major consideration behind Starship and its design, is that you need a larger vehicle that has a pretty high mass and volume capacity to bring with you the things you need to set up a lasting outpost and then grow that into a city and into being self-sustaining. So that's really one of the main goals of Starship. And then the other aspect is that you need to be reusable, right? Reusability just makes all the economics of this so much easier. And when you think of sending these large masses anywhere, they cost things, right? And even the infrastructure around us on Earth costs a lot. We sometimes forget about it. It sort of gets as a hidden cost, but the infrastructure around us costs a lot. And so reusability is a really key aspect to bring costs down, and then also the capacity to just bring a lot of mass and volume to the surface are really important. So those were some of the main considerations for Starship, and that's why it also is so different from a lot of the previous concepts of what a human Mars mission might look like.
Okay, excellent. Or some specifics with the design. Now, it's a long way to get, or it's about 8 months to go from Earth to Mars. And so what are some of the considerations that have to go into the design for getting people there? And two that pop into my head at the moment are solar activity and then the meteoroid environment. And I'm sure there are many others. So I was wondering if you could speak to any of that.
I mean, it's like the ultimate road trip, right? Except there are no gas stations along the way. To me, it's really a fascinating question, and just something that we don't think about a lot as a society. And so it requires really sort of a mind shift of how do you do it. I'm going to go back for a second to the analog work. Actually, that's one of the really valuable aspects of analog work, is that when you're doing stuff in the lab, you forget something, you order it on McMaster, or you like run out to the hardware store and you get it, and it's, when you're in space, or actually in the middle of Antarctica, there's no hardware store. You either have it or you don't. And so it teaches you a different reliance, but also a different way of designing things, and that simplicity really is key. That anything you might be able to get from more sophisticated systems maybe is not quite worth it, given that you can't repair it in the middle of the field. So going back to this long journey to Mars, one aspect is you can't actually go in less than 8 months. A lot of the plans look for more like 6 months, and if you're willing to use more propellant, you can go faster, depending on the opportunity and exactly how that works. In terms of the spacecraft, definitely a lot of things to consider there. You mentioned solar activity, so there would have to be a shelter. I think that one is actually relatively easy to deal with. There are a lot of concepts of where you just put all your water in like a cylinder, and then you have heads up that solar activity is coming, and all of you just go hang out and become really close buddies inside the cylinder surrounded by water, and just wait it out, for a day-ish that the solar activity would last. Meteor impacts, that's something as well that there's actually quite a bit of technology that we can put into that. There are a lot of there's been a lot of work on materials where you just put multiple layers, and so we'll stop by far most meteors without really the concern of puncturing the pressure vessel that you're in. There can be some more concerns when you're thinking of something like heat tiles, right? Similar to the shuttle accident, of how do you deal with that and how do you inspect for that? I think that's also something that we can deal with in terms of making sure that you can deal with the expected flaws that may happen from micrometeorite impacts on those. I think some other really fascinating aspects are actually, how do you repair your spacecraft, and how do you know your spacecraft is good to go when you're about to land? You can test some systems, you can't test all systems. You can't really turn on the engines before you get to Mars as a checkout and then land. That would be very challenging to try to figure in. So that's where also I think a lot about simplicity, and how do you build that confidence in your system that after that amount of time and space, you are okay to still land. I think that's where, for example, some of Starship's plans are actually really interesting. So the idea that it's the same vehicle that will be used in Earth orbit, on the moon, and then also on Mars, you can just get a lot more time on the systems to understand how they break, when they break. Are they okay with 8 months in space, right? You can just, if you have a cheaper system, you can just send it in space for 8 months and leave it there and see what happens. So those are some of the aspects. There's, of course, also people talk a lot about the comfort of the crew, and how do you make it. I'm a big believer in a happy crew, but I think there's also a really important aspect that, and this is an opinion I have from having gone to Antarctica and slept in a tent at -25°C for a few weeks. To be honest, it's my favorite place. I'll go back anytime. I think there's a lot to be said that when you have that excitement and motivation, and you're doing something for a reason that you really believe in, there are a lot of things that you can make it through, and a lot of things that are okay to make it through. So I actually really think that the crew that will go, their motivations will be so strong, and the excitement of actually getting to Mars will be so incredibly high that I mean, certainly something to be taken account, like there's no question in that, but in terms of, there's a lot that the people can really withstand. And I think of some of the early Arctic and Antarctic explorers. I mean, they went through things that were way harsher than anything that a Mars crew would go through, and they made it, right? With the right motivations and the right leaders within the group and all that, they made it. So I think those are things that we can overcome from many respects, just from choosing the right people and with the right motivations.
Can you walk us a little bit through how some of those first steps might look? or when you have the crew coming down, you have your location, there's water there, everything's working well, you land, now what? What are some of the first things that these crews are going to need to do?
This is my favorite thing to think about. It's just such a fascinating area to try and imagine what that looks like. As soon as they land, actually, I think the first thing is they'll do nothing. You have to take into account that at least to some degree they'll be deconditioned, right? Because they've just been in space for a long time, and certainly they'll have to exercise quite a bit on the way there to make sure that they're not very deconditioned, right? They don't have a support team when they land to take them out carefully and take care of them. But I think when they first land, you have to assume that at least for the first 36, 48 hours, they're not going to be in great shape. Yeah. That they'll mostly just be trying to regain their balance and just, slowly try to be like, okay, I can walk now. I can do these basic things. And so making the spacecraft be capable of dealing with itself for those first 48 hours, I think is really important. And it's not, as an engineering challenge, it's a totally doable engineering challenge, but I think that is important. And certainly with astronauts, some of them have no effects when they land on Earth. They get up and they're fine and no big deal. Some of them have a much more severe effects and you can't really tell the difference, or you can't tell beforehand who is going to react in a certain way. And then Mars has the lower gravity, so that's going to help, right? At the third gravity, that will certainly help with the muscle deconditioning. So, but I think at first you're going to make sure that the spacecraft can get its own power, the power being the biggest thing, and then also that they have food within easy reach so that they're not required to really get up from their landing position. After that, I think we'll go into what I've started calling the survive stage. Okay. So your first aspect, your first main job is make sure you can survive. Make sure you have the power. Make sure you have the water. So eventually you'll need water. It will probably be a pretty closed life support system, but you'll need water just for surviving. And that you're in a safe environment. All of those will be the first. And then how do you start producing the propellant, right? How do you get to the ice? I think it will be a combination of rovers, other mobility systems that go and help you explore, but also people. There's a lot that you can do just with walking around to tell what's actually there. And so I think those first steps by the astronauts on the surface will be really important for them to get a real sense of what do we have here, how do we utilize it, and then really going hardcore into utilizing it. So setting up more power will be really key, especially with going with solar power. You need a lot of it, so you have to start deploying these large solar fields, start deploying ways to get through the regolith, get to the ice, make sure the ice composition is what you expected, do checkouts on the vehicle that you just landed with and make sure that its life support system and everything else are still the way you think that they are. So I think those would be the first few days to first few months those are really going to be everything you do. That would be critical, right? You need to survive.
Yeah. Okay, great. You mentioned Starship being a vehicle that would be able to take people to the moon and Mars and to be kind of this general vehicle for space travel. So the question that comes to mind is, with all of the attention that's being paid toward the moon right now, is the moon a distraction or is it a necessary step to get to Mars?
I would call it neither.
Okay.
I think space exploration overall is very exciting. And I think having people in space and on planetary surfaces is very exciting. And when I say exciting, what I mean is that I think it really pushes us. For me, that's a really key motivation. So I certainly draw on my background. So I was actually born in Bulgaria. My parents moved to a few different places. And in each case, when we moved to Toronto, they plopped me in school. I barely knew any English. And they said, you better get straight A's. And, being a good kid, I was like, I better get straight A's. How am I going to get straight A's when I don't really even speak the language? And the reality is I came up with some pretty interesting ways to do that. For example, when we lived in Germany, again, I didn't know any German when we arrived there. We had a friend who was fluent, and so I would write out stories, I would memorize them, and then on my German exam, I would literally write it out, what I had memorized, right? Things that are just, so for me, moving from place to place and really being pushed on, this is important, you have to survive, you have to do well, is a really a way to sort of utilize your full potential, I think, is sort of the way that I would put it. And so going to the moon or going to Mars, it pushes us to do that. It pushes us to really think of new ways of doing things, pushes us to really, for example, an easy example is power efficiency. We're going to be very power poor in pretty much any planetary aspect that we go to. And so you have to be power efficient. On Earth, we'd like to be power efficient, but our life doesn't depend on it. Not yet, at least. But in space, your life depends on it. And so I think it's very ripe for a lot of innovation on how to do that. So the moon will do a lot of that. Mars will do it to an even larger extent. I think that Mars is actually a better spot for having a self-sustaining outpost that has a lot more of the resources that we need as people to survive. And so that's where a lot of my passion for Mars comes from, a lot of the excitement of, similar to Earth. But I think the moon is also super interesting, and a lot of interesting things that we can get out of it scientifically as people exploration-wise. So I would just say that they're different. Now, there's certainly the cost aspect that there of, can you really do both at the same time? But I don't think of them as we have to go to the moon in order to be able to go to Mars. Or that it's a distraction. I think you can do both, and both are interesting. I think for the moon, it will be challenging to learn about technology for Mars on the moon. The more I've looked at it, the details are just different. The environment is different. And so what you would design for the Mars, for the moon and Mars are different. And so it's hard to really take one technology and take it. Operations-wise, I think we'll learn a lot on just what are the best procedures? How do you make all that happen?
Oh, okay. Oh, great. Following on this, space is difficult, and it often requires lots of cooperation. We saw that with the ISS. We're going to, I think, see at least it somewhat in the moon. Hopefully, we see lots of it for the moon. But it's absolutely going to be a necessity for Mars. So I was wondering if you could speak to the type of cooperation that's going to be required to actually have a sustainable presence on Mars.
I completely agree. So Mars needs to be more of a collaborative endeavor. The way I like to think about it, and I'm a little bit of a optimist and idealist, I'll totally admit to that, is in order for Mars to really succeed, we need the best that we have as people of planet Earth. We really need the best ideas from the entire planet. It is challenging. It's challenging from the perspective that you have to pretty much redesign every system we take for granted on Earth. You have to redesign it to work on Mars. That's a lot of work. And then it's challenging just because of the environment and making it work in that environment. So to really succeed, I think you just need the best people from all over the world, the best ideas from all over the world. So even just from that sort of idealistic perspective, you need that collaboration. It's not going to be just one agency or one group that's going. And so, I think it's important to start talking about it in those terms and making sure that it's sort of understood that there isn't still who's going to lead it? Are we in a race to do it? That it's really very understood that it's going to be a collaborative type mission, and that it really needs to be that for it to succeed. I think it really needs to be that, and more. I mean, certainly there's sort of the political aspects of making it international cooperation, but I think even just from the success aspect, it just needs to be the best people from all over the world.
Do you think we're on track for something like that?
Well,
or can we get there? Maybe that's an easier question. Do you think we can get there?
It's definitely a hard question to really talk to. I remember being in high school and thinking, wow, I'm too late for being one of the first people on Mars. When I was in high school, the plans were to fly people to Mars in 2003, 2005, something like that. And so I remember thinking, oh no, I'm too late. I'm not going to be one of those people. It's a few years later now, and NASA's plans, Mars is still 20 years into the future, which realistically 20 years is like never, right? It's and I don't mean that in a, what I mean is that when it's 20 years in the future, you haven't started planning for it yet, right? And so it just doesn't feel real when it's 20 years into the future. So there's that side. Then of course there's the SpaceX side of, Elon and SpaceX want to go there in the next few years. And so that huge push to go there very soon. It's a little challenging when you have two such disparate perspectives. And what does the rest of the world do when you have those disparate perspectives on when people are actually going to go to Mars? I think that's certainly a challenge right now. I think it's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem, that all the ancillary but critical systems that you need to develop for people to live on Mars, it's hard for people to put money into that if there isn't a spacecraft in a way that they think it's going to get to Mars. But on the other hand, you don't want a spacecraft that goes there empty, because people didn't develop those parts. So I think right now we're in a little bit of a awkward place of, when are we going? What resources should we apply to it? I certainly hope that we'll go sooner than in 20 years, and that all of these plans will start being put into action much sooner. I think progress with Starship, and for example, Starship landing on the moon, will be really huge in giving more perspective on when we might be able to go to Mars, and really starting those ancillary ones. And the rocket aspect's certainly challenging, right? Rockets are not easy, but the ancillary aspects of how do you extract your water on Mars and how do you process it in large quantities is also a hard problem. Having rovers that last for a long time and can move a little faster than what we have right now on Mars, large problem. So I consider both of those really challenging big engineering projects that need to be worked on. So hopefully the other systems that humans need will also start being worked on soon by a lot of different groups.
Yeah. With all these different groups working together and moving forward and putting people there, and you have also the need to use the resources in order to sustain then human habitation on Mars. I'm wondering what discussions there have been, like from the industry perspective, on how things like science might fit into the exploration and sustaining a human presence on a different planet might be.
Oh, another fascinating question. So looking at it just from the perspective of, you want to put people on Mars, you want to build towards a self-sustaining city. So then if you're doing that, the question is, well, what do the people there do? How do you actually, what are their jobs? What is the goal of the city? And there are a number of answers you can give there. I think the science and exploration one will be a critical initial one. I think you need that government support and the science support at the beginning, right? And it's the same on Earth, where government agencies put a lot of money into startup technology, science projects, all of that. It's just what we do as a society, right? Government recognizes that not all of them will succeed, but some fraction of them will succeed, and they'll be the critical things that really bring society forward. And so government should invest at that early stage where it's difficult to get commercial capital, but government invests in that early stage to make it work in the future. I think both the moon and Mars will probably be very similar to that. And of course here, it's my crystal ball. There are a lot of crystal balls out there, but I think in the initial stages, that's what planetary exploration will need.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a great fit, right? Governments already put a lot of money into planetary exploration as something that's interesting, something that is worthy to fund. And so in this case, you would just be probably collaborating with some sort of commercial entity, but again saying, hey, we think it's worth it to send a scientist to Mars to study the surface. I dream of the day when postdocs go to Mars for their 2-year postdoc. That would be the coolest thing ever. So I think that science and exploration will be very critical at the beginning. And certainly also you need the science to support the human habitation there, right? They all go together. All resource companies on Earth have a science team and exploration team that just does hardcore science to figure out where the resources are. That would be on Mars and the moon as well as just overall, right? There's a lot of basic science that's really fascinating to do on both of those bodies. So science at first is really important, but then it's also really interesting to think about what do you do afterwards, and what fraction of your support comes from science and exploration versus other sources, and what are those other sources?
We are running close to the end of our time, so I wanted to ask you one kind of really big picture question. And this is a question that we talk about around the lunch table and all these other things, and that is the role of robots versus humans in space. And there's a pretty broad spectrum here with people who will say, no, we have to have humans in space. It's only humans can really know what to do with the rock. And then you have other people who will say, nonsense, robots are the best way to go and you don't risk the lives of humans. Could you just comment on this? And it is actually a pretty passionate debate that's held around lunch tables and so forth among scientists. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, I have my science answer and my personal answer. So as a science answer, there have been a number of studies done where they have tried to compare the efficacy of a robot versus a person. And there was one study, I forget now which desert in the US, but done in a desert in the US where they took a rover that had similar capabilities to the Mars rovers. The scientists were in a control room, did not know where the rover was.
Okay.
Other people put the rover in a desert that had a lot of fossils and signs of life all over the place. The scientists were given a week with the Mars delay imposed on them and everything, and the same constraints as you would have for one of the Mars rovers to explore. They never found a single sign of life. They were then taken to that desert, put into the field, and within an hour, they had multiple signs of life that they had found themselves. I think that is illustrative. And certainly from my experience of doing field work, it's just different when you can, you walk, you, even with your hand, take some of the sand away and look what's underneath there. Or you wake up in the morning and you're like, wow, my tent is covered with dew. Wait a minute, is dew something that the organisms here can use as a water source? A lot of these things are not observations that a robot can really readily make. If you think that's the case, you can put instruments on it to measure those things. But it's hard for a robot, I think, to make those initial instruments. And also just the speed. If we look at the rovers that are on Mars and what speed they're going versus what a person can go and explore and look at if they're walking around, break a few rocks to see what's inside of them or scratch the veneer off of them. For a robot, that's such a huge thing that they need to do, and it takes multiple days to get them to do even a simple one, versus for a person, it's 10 minutes. So I think there is a huge disparity there. And certainly I'm talking in broad terms, and robots have a lot of great uses, but there is still the human cognition and the looking at it and just being able to move your head a little bit and just like get perspective of the place and even sort of the 3D view of what's happening, I think is really key and improves productivity hugely. And I think there's also the personal aspect of it. So why do we explore? Exploration is not just about how much science can we get out of a place. People go and visit Europe. they go and visit other parts of the world. They're not going there for science. They're going there as an intrinsic exploration aspect. People move to other countries. Sometimes it's for a better job, but sometimes it's for the experience of being in a different culture and being in a different environment. I think there really is something very intrinsic in us where exploration is just, it's something we do. And I think it's easy to see little kids do it, right? When, sort of before society imposes anything on them, what they do is explore. Like that's, they want to get into every cabinet, look at everything, dig every little patch in the backyard to see what's there. And so I think it's a very intrinsic thing that is part of us. And I think it's an important part of us. It's not just, I don't know, it's a way to learn, but I think it's just very intrinsic to human nature to want to explore, and that's also a way that we've bettered ourselves, right? Mm-hmm. There are a lot of examples through human history where, even in, much earlier, many thousands of years ago, when people moved to a new location, a lot of time that was accompanied by a big improvement in capabilities and really a new way of living. And so I think there's the scientific aspect of why do we want people to go, and I think it's more efficient, but I think at least as equally important is the aspect of we're explorers and we'll always push the limits. We'll go to the bottom of the ocean, we'll go to space, we'll go to other planets, and that's important for us just to be human.
It's an excellent way to, I think, end the interview. Dr. Marinova, it has been absolutely wonderful talking with you. Thank you so much for all of this insight that you've provided us, you have with Mars. And thank you to everyone who watched this. And please look out for more interviews that we'll be conducting here for the Outer Space Institute. It's just one part of what we do as an organization as we're looking toward the development and the sustainable and responsible development of space. So thank you to you, and thank you again, Dr. Marinova.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.